Welcome back to The Last Climb. Today I'll go over a case where four businessmen openly questioned and belittled a Sherpa's judgment, convinced their plan and payment mattered more than experience. They pushed ahead through worsening weather and a known weak fixed rope section, stubborn to the point of ignoring clear warnings. What happened higher on that ridge is what makes the whole thing hard to forget. It was October 8th, 2020, when four businessmen from suburban Chicago landed at Lukla Airport in northeastern Nepal, one of the most demanding airstrips in the world. At 9,383 feet above the Dud Koshi Valley, it marked the beginning of an environment where schedules, status, and delegation no longer carried any weight. They were participating in a standard commercial Lobuche East expedition rather than a longer Everest Base Camp program, meaning the entire expedition was expected to be completed over roughly a week rather than following a longer Everest Base Camp itinerary. There was this guy, Caden Halsman, 48, working as a regional vice president out of suburban Chicago. About a year or so before the trip, he hears a colleague talking about this guided climb up Kilimanjaro. Nothing crazy at first, but it sticks with him. And then it kind of escalates in his head. He doesn't just want a normal trip. He wants something bigger than that. Higher, more impressive, something people actually notice. Lobuche East ends up being the one that fits that idea, sold as this accessible Himalayan peak. Something ambitious professionals can do even without serious climbing backgrounds. And honestly, the whole thing starts to feel less like a vacation and more like a project. Like there's a goal, a provider, a schedule, all of it lined up. Even people back home kind of know about it already. He's mentioning it in newsletters, talking about it on professional platforms. Like it's something already in motion before he even leaves. The others in the group are pretty similar in profile. Craig LaGuardia, 52, a CFO he'd done Mount Whitney before, and took that as proof he could handle serious altitude. Neil Wachter, 45, operations guy, probably the most physically prepared of the group, and the one who tends to soften the guide's technical warnings when he repeats them back, making them sound a bit more manageable than they actually are. And then there's Yael Dockwilin, 44, account manager. His costs are partly covered by Caden. He doesn't really push back on anything, even though privately he thinks the plan is a bit aggressive, goes along with it. Collectively, the four men had built careers around managing projects, deadlines, and outcomes by delegating expertise to specialists. They arrived in Nepal, assuming this expedition would function the same way. The company they hired was reputable, and their assigned lead guide, Pemba Dorje Sherpa, had guided Lobuche East 14 times and summited Everest twice. His approach was neither overly cautious nor aggressive. It was precise, relying on weather, conditions, and objective safety margins rather than client expectations. That decision framework, built over 14 years on Himalayan terrain, would soon collide with four men who increasingly viewed the summit not as a possibility to be earned, but as a result they had already purchased. The deposits had become non-refundable, past a date in March. Return flights and work commitments had already been arranged around a narrow expedition schedule. The entire trip had been built around a specific sequence of dates, leaving very little room for delays once they arrived in Nepal. Even before the climb began, the ending had already been mentally scheduled. Their lead guide was Pemba Dorje Sherpa, 39, from Namche Bazaar. He had guided Lobuche East 14 times, summited Everest twice, and built a reputation not on caution but precision. His decisions were based on the specific conditions of a specific day, not client expectations or predetermined schedules. He had never lost a client. During a 45-minute briefing in Lukla, he covered altitude illness, weather windows, turnaround criteria, and oxygen monitoring protocols. The group quickly established a different dynamic. Halsman repeatedly redirected the discussion toward summit photography and logistics, subtly signaling that the outcome mattered more than the process designed to get them there safely. As they trekked through the Khumbu, all four men began showing minor altitude symptoms, including headaches, reduced appetite, and fatigue. During Pemba's daily health checks, they consistently downplayed their condition. Within the group's social hierarchy, admitting difficulty meant becoming the weak link, and no one was willing to occupy that role. Pemba noticed the gap between what they reported and what he observed, and quietly adjusted his risk assessment accordingly. At Namche Bazaar, Pemba conducted a second, more detailed briefing, focused on the upper mountain mixed rock and ice terrain above 18,700 feet, the condition of fixed ropes late in the season, and the behavior of post-monsoon weather systems in the Khumbu. He emphasized that weather windows often become less predictable by mid-October, as post-monsoon systems begin transitioning across the region. The information was delivered as probability and pattern, not certainty. Wachter later reframed it for the others as a simple possibility that it might get a little breezy toward the end of the week. That version of the forecast was the one the group carried forward.
I can't help thinking about how much gets flattened in that moment. A structured risk briefing turns into something almost casual, and once it becomes casual, it stops carrying the same weight it was meant to have.
During an extended discussion at base camp about worsening weather forecasts, the disagreement between guide and clients became more openly confrontational. Pemba reiterated his recommendation to hold position due to sustained high winds developing on the upper ridge and the increased probability of a system arriving within the planned summit window. They started mocking the idea that conditions were something that could actually override a fixed plan, brushing off Pemba's warnings like they were overcautious routine talk. At one point, there were remarks about Sherpas always saying no when things get interesting, said in a way that made it clear they weren't taking the judgment seriously anymore. It wasn't loud, but it shifted the room, like his experience had been reduced to hesitation instead of expertise. So at that point, LaGuardia starts pushing back a lot harder than before. He's basically questioning the weather forecasts outright, like, how reliable are these really? And he keeps coming back to this idea that the guiding company has a responsibility to deliver a safe summit opportunity within the plan they all agreed to. But the tone isn't just curious anymore, it kind of shifts. It becomes more critical. Like he's suggesting the guides are being too cautious, maybe even overreacting to normal Himalayan weather changes. It even gets to the point where they start mocking the caution coming from Pemba, like he's being overly careful for no reason. It's not just disagreement anymore, it's the kind of tone that makes it clear they don't really respect the warning the same way he's giving it. And then Halsman jumps in too, and that kind of sets the tone for the room. In front of everyone's staff, other climbers. He makes a comment that questions whether the operation is actually being led by someone who can handle this level of expedition, or if they're just defaulting to delay whenever things start to look uncertain.
He knows exactly what that does in a group like this. And I think even saying it once changes how every future decision gets heard.
He doesn't directly insult the guide, not openly, but it's clear what he's implying. It's less about asking questions at that point, and more about challenging whether the decision-making authority is even in the right hands anymore. A brief silence followed. One of the support Sherpas later described the exchange as the point where the relationship between guide and clients stopped being purely operational and became adversarial in tone, even if still restrained on the surface. Pemba did not respond to the remark in kind. He acknowledged the concern, restated the forecast-based recommendation, and ended the briefing shortly afterward without further discussion. The decision framework remained unchanged, but the authority underpinning it was no longer fully intact in the group's perception.
In my view, nothing really changes on paper here, but you can already feel it slipping a bit, right? It's still there, still official, but it doesn't carry the same weight anymore. Like direct-to-DVD movies.
By October 12th, the team reached Lobuch Base Camp at approximately 17,600 feet after several days moving through the Khumbu Valley. The pace was typical for a commercial Lobuch East itinerary, but tensions between guide and clients were already becoming noticeable. Pemba's weather updates were now showing sustained high winds developing on the upper ridge, and he recommended a rest day to avoid entering the peak of the forecast system. LaGuardia objected, focusing on expedition cost per day and the need to maintain their planned summit window. Halsman supported the concern about timing. During the discussion, in front of both support staff and guides, a remark was made suggesting that another guiding operation might be more aligned with their schedule. Pemba did not engage with the comment directly, and his recommendation remained unchanged. The following day, conditions briefly improved, and the group completed a rotation to high camp at around 19,000 feet before descending again to recover as planned. The effort level, however, was noticeably higher than anything experienced on the lower mountain. Dockwilin vomited twice during the ascent and required extended rest at altitude before recovering enough to continue.
From where I was observing the group dynamic, it didn't really register as a warning at the moment. The assumption seemed to be that this was just part of adjusting to altitude, something temporary that would pass with rest, even though the strain on him looked more significant than anyone was openly acknowledging.
The group interpreted his eventual recovery as a successful adaptation rather than a warning sign. Within the group, this was interpreted as a standard acclimatization response rather than a performance concern. The fact that he was able to continue after rest reinforced that interpretation, even though, from a guiding perspective, it represented a clear indicator of limited physiological margin at elevation. Pemba noted the symptom progression without elevating its urgency in a way that would have broken the group's confidence in the itinerary. By this stage, corrective signals were being observed, but their meaning was no longer being translated into operational change. By October 14th, updated forecasts from regional monitoring services showed a significant shift. A low-pressure system moving north from the Bay of Bengal was now expected to arrive during their planned summit window, bringing a substantially increased likelihood of high winds above 60 miles per hour at elevation. What had previously been a moderate risk had become a high probability weather event overlapping directly with their schedule.
And from where I'm standing in the story, this is the point where the mountain stops being a background factor and starts directly competing with the plan they already committed to.
So, Pemba called a formal briefing and laid out the updated forecast. He gave them two clear options. Either push faster and try to summit before the weather system fully moved in, or delay and wait it out after it passed. He was very direct about it. The planned summit window now sat right inside the most dangerous part of the forecast. But the group rejected both options. And delaying didn't really work for them either because of return flights and work commitments they'd already lined up back home. So the original summit date just stayed in place. Not really as a climbing decision anymore, but more like a fixed schedule they were holding on to. From that point on, it wasn't really about changing based on conditions, it was just about timing. Pemba noted his recommendation and kept preparing.
That part just sits with me a bit, because nothing forces that decision. It just kind of holds itself in place.
Later that afternoon, several operational clarifications from Pemba were met with increasing resistance rather than acknowledgement. When he reiterated that summit decisions were conditional on real-time weather thresholds, LaGuardia responded that they understood the mountain had variability, but that a guided expedition of this level should be able to operate within expected seasonal patterns. The distinction Pemba was drawing between forecast behavior and acceptable risk thresholds carried less weight for the group than it did within the guiding framework itself. His recommendations increasingly functioned as advisory input rather than operative direction within a preset plan. The team moved to high camp in clear conditions that evening, deceptively stable weather that often precedes rapid change at altitude. Temperatures dropped sharply, and wind readings increased on upper instruments. At camp, Dockwillin's oxygen saturation measured 82%, below the general threshold associated with increased risk on technical terrain. Pemba noted the reading, but the group did not revisit the plan. Departure remained unchanged. They left before dawn under relatively manageable conditions. Light wind, low temperatures, and sufficient visibility for headlamp travel. The lower glacier section was straightforward, and the group moved at a pace consistent with their acclimatization profile. By the time they reached the base of the upper ridge, daylight was breaking and the horizon had shifted into a dense, pressurized gray.
82 there just feels wrong in a quiet way. Like, you don't argue with it out loud, but you notice the pace tightening a bit after that, almost without anyone saying anything.
Pemba paused for a weather check. Winds on the exposed ridge ahead were approaching operational limits. He advised continuing to a higher checkpoint for reassessment, with a firm turnaround threshold set for sustained high winds. The group agreed and continued. Higher on the ridge, their pace began to degrade. Halsman was visibly slowing, and Docklin showed clear signs of coordination, failure-labored breathing, and increasingly unsteady movement on the ice. Pemba recommended that both descend with a support Sherpa. LaGuardia and Wachter, still performing more effectively, pushed to continue. The group refused to split. The consensus held that they were within a short distance of the summit, a distance that, at that altitude and angle, represented not terrain but decision-making under depletion. They reached the summit of La Bouche East. Photographs were taken. Winds were severe, temperatures extreme, and visibility narrowing as cloud cover advanced across the ridgelines in real time. Pemba immediately began organizing the descent, but the group remained briefly on the summit, continuing photographs and remarks about the view before finally moving down. Descent began shortly after leaving the summit. Within minutes, cloud cover reduced visibility to under 100 feet. The change was not gradual in the way the group had experienced at lower elevations, but rapid and cumulative wind noise increasing to the point where voice communication required effort, terrain losing definition, and the horizon collapsing into uniform gray. The group descended the upper fixed rope section in a single line, with a support Sherpa leading, followed by Doquillin, Halsman, Wachter, LaGuardia, and Pemba at the rear.
If it was in me, that line, I'd already feel how quickly the mountain just takes the whole situation out of your control. Like, you're still moving, but the environment is doing most of the deciding now.
Almost immediately, the descent conditions wiped out most of the visual reference points they'd used on the way up. Steps that had felt simple earlier in the day now needed constant checking, and the rope, usually just a backup, became the main way they were moving. Everything slowed into a careful shuffle, guided more by rope spacing and tension than by the terrain itself. The route then crossed into a mixed rock and ice section along a narrow ridge where a fixed rope line had a known issue. Earlier that morning, a 30-foot segment had shown a visible sag, suggesting one of the anchors wasn't fully holding. It had still been manageable on the ascent because of how the load was applied going upward. But on the way down, everything changed. With fatigue, wind, and downward loading, that same section became hard to read, neither clearly safe nor clearly unstable, leaving very little time or space for anyone to properly reassess it before they were already on it.
I'd be paying way more attention to the rope itself than the ground, because at that point the rope is basically the only thing telling you where safe even is.
Halsman reached the section first among the clients, moving against gusts now consistently above 50 miles per hour. His progression slowed as he tested each step, transferring weight cautiously onto the rope line. As he committed to the traverse, the rope failed to provide sufficient stabilizing resistance. At nearly the same moment, his crampon struck a thin glaze of verglas on the edge of a rock shelf, an almost invisible film of ice over stone, and failed to gain purchase. He slid approximately 12 feet off the shelf onto a steep ice face below the ridge and did not successfully initiate a self-arrest before momentum carried him downslope. The rope system immediately loaded under sudden tension. Doquillin, positioned above him and already showing reduced coordination from altitude stress, was pulled off balance before he could stabilize. The system response, whether from carabiner failure, anchor release, or rope overload, could not later be definitively determined. What is clear from physical evidence is that Doquillin separated from the main line within seconds and fell along a separate trajectory east of Halsman's path. The rope team fractured into independent fall lines almost immediately after the initial failure. Wachter, higher up on the ridge, only caught a brief look at what was happening before the clouds thickened and the shape of the terrain cut everything off again. After that, he lost sight completely. His first reaction was just to steady himself sideways against the ice instead of trying to move forward into it. Then he tried calling down to the lead Sherpa below, but the wind was too strong, his voice just didn't carry. Down below, The lead Sherpa was already out of sight past the crux section, blocked by the slope and the whiteout.
At that point, it's not really a view anymore. It's more like you're just standing inside noise and white space, trying to guess what's even still connected to what.
Within moments, the system stopped functioning as a coherent rope team. Pemba and the rear support Sherpa remained above the crux section, still attached to LaGuardia, but communication down the line had effectively broken. Below them, the lead Sherpa was isolated in a separate section of the route. Wachter was stationary on the ridge, no longer responding to directional cues. LaGuardia, positioned between Pemba and the upper failure points, also ceased responding to instruction and later appeared far below his last confirmed position in a descent consistent with uncontrolled movement. No evidence of arrest attempts was identified in the recovered terrain data. As conditions continued to deteriorate, Wachter moved laterally eastward away from the established descent line. His crampon tracks initially reflected controlled movement, with consistent spacing and depth, suggesting deliberate navigation rather than panic. Over distance, however, the pattern became irregular. Spacing widened, pressure marks weakened, and directionality became less consistent until the tracks ended at the edge of a cornice overhang. Under whiteout conditions, the overhang presented visually as continuous snow surface, with no visible indication of the drop beyond. Pemba and both support Sherpas executed a controlled retreat from the crux section, using short anchored movements and fixed rope protection through near zero visibility. Their descent remained deliberate and segmented, prioritizing terrain security over speed. Upon reaching high camp, Pemba initiated emergency contact with the Himalayan Rescue Association, reporting 4 clients missing or fallen and providing last known positions for each.
I feel weird reading this. It starts like normal steps, then slowly stops matching the rope line, like he drifted off it without noticing.
Bad weather kept helicopters from getting in right away. Strong winds and on and off snowfall basically shut down access to the upper mountain for long stretches, so neither air support nor higher ground teams could move in safely. Even when things eased up for a bit, search teams tried to push in, but they kept having to turn back because conditions on the ridge were still too unstable. Then on the morning of October 16, there was a short window, maybe 4 to 6 hours before another weather system was expected to move in. A helicopter out of Lukla used that gap to fly a survey over the west face and east ridge of Lobuch East. During that pass, all 4 climbers were spotted in different positions across the slope, roughly between 18,900 and 19,600 feet. Their locations were logged and confirmed, but the weather started closing in again fast, and they had to break off before any recovery work could even begin.
It's just a short window, and they're trying to get coordinates in while the wind is already forcing them out.
Full recovery was completed over the following 3 days during intermittent weather breaks, using both air and ground teams. 2 of the 4 locations required technical rigging due to steep and unstable terrain. All recoveries were concluded by the end of the final operational window. Official findings, later issued by national tourism authorities and communicated to families through diplomatic channels, classified the deaths as consistent with blunt force trauma from uncontrolled falls on steep mixed terrain, with hypothermia identified as a contributing factor in multiple cases. Autopsies found no evidence that acute altitude illness directly caused any of the deaths. While all 4 men showed physiological signs consistent with prolonged exposure to high altitude, reduced oxygen efficiency, and mild cerebral stress, these were assessed as background conditions rather than primary causes. In practical terms, the conclusion was straightforward. None of the deaths resulted from the altitude itself, but from falls. Those falls occurred in conditions shaped by cumulative fatigue, a deteriorating weather system that had been forecast in advance, and a sequence of decisions that steadily reduced the margin for error. Pemba Dorje Sherpa provided a full account to investigators within 48 hours. His statement aligned with the physical evidence, including rope analysis, track data, and recovery positions. No findings were made against any member of the guiding team. The incident was officially classified as a fatal mountaineering accident resulting from client non-compliance with guide recommendations under deteriorating environmental conditions. Supporting communication records, including earlier whether advisories and objections to the planned summit date were consistent with his testimony.